You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening because we have as our guest Heather Mac Donald. Look, getting right to it, Heather's written this book, The War on Cops, right?
Right.
So just tell me, you're here in Chicago. We're taping it. It's at Nico's Osteria right here in the Gold Coast. We're taping this show on September 28th. And when was it? A bit of 2016? Just about 2 years ago. Laquan McDonald. You know that name?
Sure.
Okay. So the copper gets out. 6 cops are there. They're doing nothing. He gets out of his car. 16 shots in 16 seconds. This kid's doing nothing. He's got a small knife, African American, harming nobody. Dead. And then there's a cover-up by the state's attorney, I'd say. Okay, not a cover-up, but a year later, she still hasn't indicted. The video, you got to know this after a month or two, murder. A year goes by, nothing from the state's attorney. The mayor keeps the video out. He's reelected. War on cops or war on blacks? Come on. Laquan McDonald.
Laquan McDonald was an appalling shooting and an appalling response by the police department. That the false narrative that was put out by those cops and not blocked by Superintendent Gary McCarthy or the Detectives Bureau was a complete betrayal of the public trust. But that's one police shooting. This year in Chicago, 3,000 people have been shot. If the Black Lives Matter narrative was correct, since practically all those 3,000 victims have been black, you would assume that cops are responsible for a considerable part of those shootings. In fact, the cops have shot 18 people, 6 of them lethally, virtually all armed and dangerous. That's 0.6% of all people who've been shot in Chicago. Absolutely, the police need better tactical training, not to have made the appalling tactical decisions that resulted in the Laquan McDonald shooting. But you could remove all police shootings, either in Chicago or in the country as a whole, stop them entirely, and you would have a negligible effect on the black death by homicide rate, because blacks are being killed overwhelmingly by other blacks.
Of course, you're right on the numbers. I'd like to see, we'll have somebody from the other side on to give their view, but I'd like to hear what they say in response to your numbers. But still, if you're in the black community and you see, it's bad enough when a black shoots another black, but when the police, who are there to protect and serve, come out and just kill you, there's no excuse, right, for Laquan McDonald. Maybe he's crazy and that would be the excuse, but he's been on the force for 10 or 15 years. This isn't the first issue. And when that happens, I think we got like 12,000 cops here in Chicago. Just take a guess. Of those 12,000, you think there are a few others like that cop who shot Laquan McDonald?
Jeff, I have said this was a bad shooting. I think the criminal prosecution is appropriate. I think the cover-up was a stain on the Chicago Police Department and justifiably adds to mistrust of the police. But the perception that we are living through an epidemic of police shootings of black males is completely a media creation. Last year,
Michael Brown?
Absolutely. Well, we know that Michael Brown, that was a
Eric
hoax.
Garner?
Michael Brown, that was a lie. He was not hands up, don't shoot. He was attacking Officer Darren Wilson.
It was a justified, righteous shoot, you're saying, because he was grabbing for a gun. Is that it?
That's what the Justice Department found. Don't take my word for it. People in the community who saw the facts, they were terrified to be served with a grand jury subpoena. They barricaded themselves in their apartments with couches, because if they had told the truth about that shooting, the backlash against them would have been so great. The pressure to maintain the false narrative was so great. That Michael Brown is an appropriate emblem of the Black Lives Matter narrative, because it is the whole movement is based on a lie, which is that there's an epidemic.
The whole movement?
The idea that we are living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of blacks is a lie. And let me explain to you why, Jeff.
Okay.
Last year, the police shot 987 people fatally. 50% of all victims were white, 26% were black. Now, if the media focused on those white victims, we might think that we were living through an epidemic of police shootings of whites.
Bad things happen to both whites and blacks. That's your point?
Exactly.
By cops. It's not racial. Some mistakes happen,
There are
some very bad
bad
mistakes.
shootings, but
Okay.
but blacks, the 20s. Let's look at the 26% share of fatal shootings that are of black victims. That is actually less than would be predicted by blacks' violent crime rates. In the 75 largest counties in this country, blacks are 15% of the population. They commit nearly 2/3 of all violent crime. Police shootings are going to occur where police most encounter armed and resisting suspects. And unfortunately, given the vast disparities in violent crime rates, that is in minority communities on behalf of minority victims, and the police will be given descriptions of minority suspects. The police don't wish this reality. It's forced on them by the reality of crime. This year alone, 4 academic studies have come out that turn the Black Lives Matter narrative on its head. They show that if there's a bias in police shootings, it works in favor of blacks, not against them. Again, this is hard to
What it
believe.
is, just take them off real quick. Can you take them off? What are
Sure.
the 4 studies?
Lois James in Washington State University did the most sophisticated scenario-based
We don't have to go
simulation.
through it. Just take them off. What are the 4 studies? I want people to know where
Lois
they can go
James
look.
from Washington State University, Roland Fryer, a black Harvard economist, the Center for Policing Equity, and Ted Miller, an economist in Maryland in injury
So
prevention.
you're telling me Lester Holt got hold of this, and when he was doing the presidential debate the other night, Lester Holt from NBC, he saw what you're saying, and he said, I'm going to correct some of this. We're going to ask Hillary about this and see what she thinks. Is that what happened?
If only.
So why doesn't that happen? Did you think of trying to get in touch with Lester before, and do you think he would have paid attention to your 4 studies? Because you know what happened. Tell the people what happened. What happened in that debate between Trump and Hillary Clinton about this issue?
Well, Lester Holt continued this idea that somehow a federal judge has declared every single pedestrian stop that the police make in the country unconstitutional. No federal judge has the power to do that.
Tell us what happened. Who was the federal judge, and what did he do? She do?
This is a federal judge in New York City, Shira Scheindlin, who violated judicial ethics by encouraging groups like the Legal Aid Society, the New York Civil Liberties Union, to file lawsuits against the New York Police Department. And she promised that she would steer them into her courtroom. She already knew what her rulings were going to be, and she presided over a trilogy of lawsuits against the New York Police Department.
So what happened to her as a result of?
She was removed from after ruling against the New York Police Department. Her judgment was taken on appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which their first ruling said that she should be taken off the case because she violated judicial ethics.
And then there was a change in management, so to speak. When that appeal was going on, who was the mayor of the city of Chicago?
It began under Michael Bloomberg,
So he was
who was a
supporting the
big
appeal.
supporter of proactive policing,
Stop, question, and frisk.
among other techniques, yes.
And then he was replaced by?
Our Sandinista-loving progressive mayor, Bill de Blasio, he of 2
Put
New
out there
Yorks.
so fair and balanced.
I'm
right?
sorry, who told this? The New York Times.
Okay, so replaced by de Blasio, and the police chief in New York is?
Well, it was William Bratton until very
And
recently.
Bratton, apparently, from your book, The War on Cops, you discussed this issue. So that's why I learned about it, folks. War on Cops, Heather McDonald. There you go. There's the camera, Jeff. Heather McDonald, The War on Cops. Really good read. And you can read it quickly because I read it almost in the last day. Even though I got it, I sat on it, but,
Speed
it's-
reader or else.
It's good. No, so
Skimming.
you go through that whole incident, but what I was curious about, and you would know, you're with the Manhattan Institute in New York. You're a fellow there. You write for the City Journal,
Right.
published out of New York.
Yes.
So you're a New Yorker, true and true. So Bratton started all of this stop and frisk. I learned from you, I think, in '94. and it was very effective. He goes off and sort of does the same thing right in Los Angeles. Police chief there, comes back to be as police chief again now under de Blasio.
Really?
So he supported de Blasio in not appealing this issue. Is that right? On
Right.
stop and frisk.
Right.
Okay.
De Blasio had run against the NYPD.
And so Lester Holt, when he said to Trump, look, the court held it was unconstitutional because blacks were being discriminated against by stop and frisk. So many blacks were being stopped and not many whites. Isn't that what Lester Holt said? I'm paraphrasing.
I mean,
Lester
I
kind of
don't
got
know
it
if he
all
went into that amount.
a
Yes,
little
that's,
bit because
that's,
Trump then tried to explain and said, no, that's not what happened. And I'm not sure what he said exactly. He didn't know the ins and outs about the judge being removed. But in a sense, Holt was fact-checking Trump and got it wrong. Seriously, don't you think he did? Or am I going too far?
Well, yes, he overstated it again.
Okay.
Stop, question, and frisk is a constitutional power that all police have. The judge cannot declare stop, question, and frisk per se unconstitutional.
And if the judge does that, then it goes up on appeal to the circuit court and eventually, if they want, to
But
the
it would,
Supreme Court.
yes, I mean, she was talking about as applied by the New York Police Department.
Okay, not the whole general concept, which is
Can't.
kind of what
The
Holt was
Supreme
saying.
Court in 1965 said gave its constitutional
so-
imprimatur on a long-standing, it's simple common sense. Police officers have to be able to use their knowledge of crime conditions, local communities, suspicious behavior in order to intervene in suspicious behavior before it ripens into a felony. You do not, what's going on in Chicago right now is officers are driving by suspicious behavior. They are driving by the large groups of kids hanging out
They're
on
being
corners
derelict,
fighting.
as some Black Lives Matter people now say, because they're not doing this. Aren't some Black Lives Matter people saying the police are being derelict because they're driving by?
Yes, Sean King, one of the big activists. The hypocrisy is simply stunning. These are the same people who, for the last 2 years, have been accusing cops of racism, for stops, for broken windows policing. And then when they see the consequences of depolicing, now they say they're being derelict. But let me just say they are not being derelict. This is a discretionary activity. Cops do not have to get out of their cars. They have to respond to 911 calls. That's reactive policing. That's after there's been a victim. And in Chicago, officers are still running to those calls when somebody's been robbed or somebody's been shot.
But they're not being proactive.
They're not being proactive, but that is
Reactive
within their
and not
discretion.
proactive.
Right, and that takes us back to the pre-1990s policing
And
revolution.
what was that theory that Bratton brought into New York with Giuliani?
Bratton brought in an entire sea change in how policing thought about itself, which is we don't react to crime, we have the capacity to lower it.
2 words I'm looking for. 2 words.
Data-driven proactive policing.
And 2 more
CompStat.
words. Data-driven, broken
accountable,
glass. Broken glass?
accountable, broken windows.
What's data? Oh, sorry. Broken windows. Data-driven. Tell people about that. Why was that so important in New York? What was the revolution there?
Until Bratton came in, top brass, who were responsible ultimately, should be, for the public safety, did not know what crime was until 6 months after the fact. It sort of dawned on Bratton and his commanders that this is not the ideal way to stop crime. So they started demanding timely information, initially on a daily basis, eventually on an hourly basis.
Got it. Because the computer revolution occurred, CompuStat was there. They asked where were the crimes occurring so we could redeploy police. That worked. Giuliani was all for that. People in New York loved it. They loved Giuliani. The blacks loved it. The whites loved it because blacks are the people who suffer the most from crime. If it's disproportionately done by blacks, they're not running up here in Chicago to Winnetka. They're doing it in Englewood where blacks live. The bad guys are often blacks. The good guys are black. Black on black crime. They would love it if we did more. I don't even know. Do you know in Chicago, are we doing CompuStat? Are we doing data-driven police work here in Chicago? Do you know? I don't know.
Sure,
We are.
absolutely.
So it spread like wildfire. This concept started in New York, but in most of the inner cities, it's mimicked now,
Well,
until recently at least.
Well, there are still, I'm sure, crime analysis meetings. Gary McCarthy, your previous superintendent,
Right.
who Emmanuel made the scapegoat, but he was complicitous in holding back the Laquan McDonald video.
Country or not?
McCarthy ran CompStat in New York City. He brought the New York City style of CompStat to Chicago, which ruffles
He did.
feathers.
Okay, so he
Of
did.
course.
He
And
ruffled
I'm sure
feathers.
Jody Weiss was doing it before him. It's
Okay,
very aggressive.
it's
The New
pretty
York
okay.
style, you bring a precinct commander in, and you basically, it's viewed as humiliating. The top brass are absolutely ruthless, putting him on the hot seat. And if he does not know about every single shooting and robbery in his precinct over the last month and was ready with a strategy to combat it, his career is in jeopardy, if not over.
Broken windows came in New York, came in other places. What's that?
This is the response to low-level public order offenses. It is quintessentially what I hear in Chicago, what I hear in the South Bronx is kids are trespassing in my lobby and smoking weed. I'm terrified to go down and get my mail. They're hanging out on
What's
the
the
corners.
woman's name? You mentioned that in the book.
Mrs. Sweeper,
Mrs. Sweeper,
an elderly cancer
Tell them about Mrs.
amputee.
Sweeper. It's important. She's a real person.
She's
This is
a
what Hillary
real
and Trump
person.
do. You do it. Tell us about Mrs. Sweeper.
Listen, these voices have to be heard because they are silenced by the mainstream media. This is an elderly cancer amputee. She has an Obama poster in her apartment, Ringley's Brothers, a prayer to Obama. She lives in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx. She told me, please, Jesus, send more police. The only time she feels safe to go into her building lobby to get her mail is when the police are there because it's otherwise colonized by trespassing youth hanging out and smoking weed.
So that small stuff that cops go after under the broken window theory, if there's a broken window, get out there, find out who did it, clean it up, because the theory is if you're concerned about the small things, you'll also be there for the larger things. Is that right?
That's one aspect
That's
of
one
the
aspect.
theory.
What
Is that
other
is
aspects?
Well, it is true that by stopping people, questioning them, and possibly summoning them for misdemeanors, you often interrupt a felony at a later time. If guys are hanging out on a corner at 11 a.m., drinking in publicly, if you can get up and pour out their 40-ounce malt, you're probably averting a stabbing at 11 p.m. So that's one aspect, which is the stopping felony crime. But I would argue that even if you could not make that argument that by enforcing low-level crimes you stop felony crimes, regardless, broken windows policing is a moral imperative because that's what the law-abiding residents of these high-crime areas beg the police to do.
Mrs. Sweeper, the
Mrs.
minorities,
Sweeper,
the African Americans, the
Baltimore,
blacks,
the
the people who
Justice-
are getting pummeled by these criminals.
The Justice Department recently came out with a scathing review of the Baltimore Police Department. They objected to corner clearing. Lo and behold, the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post both, within weeks of the Justice Department report, went to a few community police meetings at long last. The Justice Department lambasted them for corner clearing. What did they hear? What did the reporters hear? Why aren't you clearing the corners? What are the police supposed to do?
Chris Wallace is doing the third debate. Why don't you spend some time with Chris? You've been on O'Reilly. You've been on Fox and Friends. These people listen to you. How great would it be? A 90-minute debate, 10 minutes of Trump and Hillary having this kind of back and forth. Hillary talking about she's supporting Barack. We had Barack on six times. We have made enormous progress in race relations, said our president, after Ferguson. But there are still problems. And Hispanics and African Americans aren't just making these problems up. So you're going to respond to that. The law too often feels like it is being applied in a discriminatory fashion. What would you say to the president? And then tell me what you're going to say to Chris Wallace to get him to discuss this.
Well, feeling may be one thing, reality is another. If you have the President of the United States, the Democratic presidential contender, the entire mainstream media telling blacks that they live in a racist criminal justice system that treats them differently, it's not surprising that if they are stopped, they're going to feel that that's a result of racism. But every criminologist who's looked at this, no matter their political orientation, and the vast majority of them are pretty darn liberal to left, have been forced to conclude that the overrepresentation of blacks in prison is due to criminal offending and not to racism. If blacks are right hours before 5 Dallas officers were assassinated in July because of the Black Lives Matter narrative, President Obama saw fit.
Can you blame it on Black Lives Matter?
I certainly can. This was somebody who said, I am out to kill whites and kill white cops in particular, who hated cops, who believed he was...
He said he was upset by Black Lives Matter. I think he was upset
Yes,
by the
absolutely.
same things. Is probably what he meant.
So Obama, 3 hours before this shooting, said blacks are arrested at twice the rate of whites. Now, I don't know that particular statistic, but I happily concede it to President Obama. I'm sure it's true. Blacks commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined.
You're sure of that? You're sure of that?
Yes, it's federal data.
They commit these things. They're arrested. They're convicted. You don't think it's that we have racist prosecutors, we have a racist judicial system. You think these are righteous convictions, is what you're telling me.
Homicides are the gold standard. Blacks die of homicide at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. Do we think that's because of racist emergency rooms? No, the bodies are there. The convictions are there. In New York City, this is what victims and witnesses tell the New York Police Department. This is not New York Police Department talking. This is victims and witnesses. They tell the police that blacks commit 75% of all shootings in New York City, though they're 23% of the population. Add Hispanic shootings to black shootings, and you account for 98% of all shootings in New York City. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough, Jeff. This is not the police speaking. These are people in those communities giving descriptions of shooters. Whites in New York City are 34% of the population. According to victims and witnesses of shootings, they commit less than 2% of all shootings. Chicago, victims and witnesses tell the Chicago police 80% of all shootings are committed by blacks, though they're less than a third of the population. Whites are the same percentage as the Chicago police population. They commit less than 1% of all shootings.
So what is happening now? We're taping this on September 28th. In the last year or two, some people, you might be one of them, contend there's been a spike up. So after a long-term, 2-decade-long, maybe longer decline in crime, we're now seeing in certain areas, in certain inner cities, an increase in the murder rate. Certainly here in Chicago, some would say at least 7 or 8 other areas in Baltimore and D.C., where we've seen adjustments. That is, we've seen less proactive policing because of the war on cops, you might contend. And so we have less of that going on. Crime is coming back. One, is that your view?
Let me just put this on the record.
Yeah.
I coined the term the Ferguson effect, which is the twin phenomenon of officers backing off of proactive policing under the phony narrative of Black Lives Matter, that they're racist for trying to save lives in black neighborhoods. And as a result of that depolicing, crime shooting up in high crime areas above all black cities. And is this now some speculative hypothesis on my part? No, it is not. This week on Monday, the FBI finally came out with the nationwide data on crime in the whole country that confirms what I have been saying for the last 2 years.
Through the whole country it's spiking now? Is that what you're saying?
Homicides nationally
are going up.
In cities that report data are up 12%. That is almost an unprecedented 1-year increase over the last half century. In some cities between the population of 250,000 to 500, it's up 20%. And if you look at specific cities, it's up much higher. The victims overwhelmingly black. There is no question that the Ferguson effect is operating in cities today, and unless we change this false narrative, it's going to get worse.
Tell me, are there 8, 10, 12, 20 cities, inner cities across the country where you're seeing a spiking of crime in the last year or two? Would that be your contention?
Cleveland last year was up 90%. In September, in one month alone, 3 children under the age of 5 were gunned down in drive-by shootings fatally, leading the black police chief to break down in tears and say, we all protest when a police officer kills one of us. Why don't we protest when we kill each other? Milwaukee up 73%, Washington, D.C. up 54%. Chicago last year was up about 25%, I think. This year is going to be about 50%.
Some people
Minneapolis.
some people contend Chicago is driving the national data. If you take out Chicago, you may have increases, but not so strong. Would you disagree with that statement? Is Chicago driving the national
Chicago is a
spiking?
big contributor, but there is serious spikes going on elsewhere. Baltimore
How many
last year,
cities? 10, 15 other cities? Just give me a ballpark.
10. One study looked at 10. Richard Rosenfeld, who was started out as a Ferguson effect denier, then had a major change of heart to his credit for the Justice Department, no less, singled out 10 cities with specific.
Two more quick things. Heather McDonald, Yale undergrad, Stanford Law School, 15 years or so at the Manhattan Institute as a senior fellow, City Journal, regular contributor on education, on race, on education, which we should have gotten to. We'll have you back. Yes, we haven't talked about any of the root causes. I know you understand that and have things to say. But take a minute and tell me, what have I missed? What have I missed in the war in cops that we haven't talked about that's crucial that people know? And two, if somebody were here from Black Lives Matter and your Stanford Law, you can argue anything. Give me what you think would be their best argument against you.
Black Lives Matter movement advocates would invoke the names of Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Walter Scott and Eric Garner. Some of those names, I completely agree with them. Those were atrocious shootings.
You give them that. You can see that.
But they will not be able to respond to my statistics. They will not be able to prove that there is a disproportionate, when you take crime into account, a disproportionate killing of black males going on. In fact, as I say, it is less than crime rates would predict. What we've not discussed is the whole narrative about mass incarceration and the claim that the drug war is driving the black prison population. Completely false, as is the claim that the black prison population represents systemic criminal justice racism. Again, false, it represents crime. Well, I'm going to go back to that original root cause, which is fathers. I think, yes, charter schools are a second best solution, as is policing. You can eat away at the problem. I believe in KIPP. I like structure. I like order in schools. I like high expectations, no excuse for behavioral improprieties. But the most important thing is to start talking about kids need mothers and fathers. Single mothers, many are heroic, doing the best they possibly can by their kids, but the odds are against them, and statistics are unequivocal here. Children raised by single mothers face a much greater chance of getting involved in the criminal justice system. Your mayor, Rahm Emanuel, just gave a speech about gun violence in Chicago. He promised more cops. He promised community policing, as if any department would ever admit to not doing community policing. I mean, we're supposed to forget that, of course, McCarthy said he was doing, everybody says they're doing community policing. He talked about mentors. He talked about more investment in communities. He did not have the guts to say the one word that really mattered, which is fathers. Mentors are, again, a second best solution. If you want to get at the root cause, boys will tell you they need their fathers.
We're taping this here at Nikos Astoria. We're here in the Gold Coast. I so much want to thank you for coming here, Heather McDonald, from New York, for your event and taking time to do this and taking time to do the show. I'm going to ask you to promise to come back another time and do a second show where we can cover some of those things we haven't covered that are so important. And thank you so much to Nikos. Thank you so much to Heather McDonald.
Thank you, Jeff.